Hi, welcome. I'm Nancy Hall-Behrens, Director of Congregational Life here at Westminster. Men of Westminster is one of the many fellowship groups at Westminster, which falls under the Congregational Life umbrella. So I am representing Men of Westminster today. And Patrick Honeycutt, Associate Pastor for Mission and Pastoral Care, is also with us today. And he is the umbrella above the Congregational Life umbrella. At any rate, we welcome you today. Just a note about some logistics. We are going to be recording this. We are recording this so that you'll be able to view it on the church YouTube channel later. So we ask you to please not do your own private recording because you will have access to it on YouTube. So please do not record it or take any screenshots. Just appreciate that. And a little bit later, we'll be doing the question and answer period. Patrick will be handling that, but we are asking that you write any questions that you have down in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen. So anyway, I'd like to open with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Loving God, our hearts are heavy this week from so much uncertainty, tension, pain, and unrest in our nation and around the world. Be with us today as we seek to better understand one another, both here and abroad. We come to you in our need, bringing with us the needs of the world. We come to you with our faith and with our doubts, with our hopes and with our fears, and we pray for peace between nations and between neighbors. In the love of the God of life and through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So Men of Westminster would like to welcome you all to this talk by Paul Neureiter, which had originally been scheduled for one of their monthly breakfasts this spring. Since the breakfast had to be canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic, Dudley Schatterberg and I worked together to bring Paul to you by Zoom. After Paul's talk today, Men of Westminster will go on their usual summer break. They're hoping to start up their normal monthly third Friday breakfasts again in the fall, if and when conditions allow. So please watch for announcements about future speakers next fall, either in person at their breakfasts or via Zoom webinar like today. Today, Men of Westminster is pleased to present Westminster member Paul Neureiter in a talk about U.S.-China relations in light of the coronavirus pandemic. Paul is Executive Director of International Government Affairs for Amgen. Paul was previously at Pfizer and ACE Group, where he directed global government affairs. Prior to his work in the private sector, Paul spent 18 years at the State Department and Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he worked on trade and policy issues involving China and other Asian countries, including holding a senior position at the U.S. Embassy in China. Paul will speak to you for about approximately 30 minutes, and then we will take your questions, of which, as I said before, you may write your questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. And now, please welcome Paul Neureiter.
Great, terrific. Thanks very much, Nancy, and thanks everybody for coming. Actually, Dudley and I had talked for quite some time about trying to get a talk together. In fact, early last fall, when he asked me to talk a bit about what was happening in Hong Kong, there were a bunch of complications, as there always are. And so as the dates moved on, we decided to change the topic to trade issues, which were in the top of the news in November and December. And then in January, we decided to start changing the talk to about COVID. Right now, we've waited long enough, so Hong Kong is back at the center of the news. So lesson here is probably that issues related to China never change, but sort of keep rotating around and going around and around. So thanks very much for your time, and hopefully we can have some interesting discussion after my remarks. What I'm hoping to do this morning in as much time as we have is give you a little bit of sense of how China views the world and what it is thinking, both in terms of COVID, in terms of Hong Kong, and why they say some of the things that they do. My intention is not to defend China in any way or offer any particular positive or negative judgments, but to give some perspective on how they view things and how what might be driving some of their interests. A couple of themes I want to get to. First, I think it's impossible to really talk about China's perspective on anything without just a brief sense of their historical outlook and some of the historical grievances that China itself has that affect basically every way the Chinese are looking at things. How the current government may or may not, be a window into China's permanent thinking, as well as then, of course, how they've responded to COVID, and then what the recent developments in Hong Kong might mean. And if we have time, maybe some sense of how, our bilateral relationship might develop. China claims it is, with good reason, that it is the oldest existing continuous civilization, depending on how you account and what you're looking at, between 3,000 and 5,000 years of essentially continuous identifiable civilization as Chinese. And it's always comparing itself and judging itself against its own history. A real high point of that, of course, was about 1,000 years ago, where China had the highest standard of living in the world, extraordinarily well-developed civilization and society, even while the West was in the midst of the coming out of the Dark Ages. But even in the roughly 800 years following, 1000 AD, China was still extraordinarily, wealthy and well-organized and well-run government. Extraordinarily long periods of peace and stability in the various dynasties that they had. Then, starting in the 1830s, China began a long period of decline. It was described as sort of foreign humiliation, where foreigners invaded China, took away some territory, forced China to accept what China refers to as the unequal treaties, and really embarrassed and humiliated China. Of course, as part of that, China lost the island of Hong Kong, which was given to Britain in perpetuity. And then in 1900 or 1899, another long struggle resulted in the area around Hong Kong, known as the New Territories, being signed over to Britain on a 99-year lease. So Hong Kong itself was always a symbol of humiliation by foreign powers. After the collapse of the Qing dynasty in the early 1900s, China was in a period of chaos, emerging out of that in 1949 with leadership by the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, as its sort of reason of being and as its claim to legitimacy among Chinese people, is that China used to be the greatest power on earth, and that we, the Communist Party, intend to lead China back to its appropriate place of centrality in world affairs. And that is its stated goal and its stated purpose. Included in that is the idea that the only reason China really declined was because foreign powers humiliated it. And the Communist Party is the right leadership to make sure that that humiliation doesn't happen again. It's undeniable, certainly, that at least the last 40 years of that period in China have been extraordinarily successful. The economic changes and even political changes in China have been extraordinary, and most Chinese, are really quite pleased and happy about that. Any country that you give 40 years of extraordinary economic growth is probably going to have a group of people in it that believes they have some natural superiority over other folks. And so that's sort of a natural human response to this run of extraordinarily good progress. That's not to say that Chinese have increased their sense of confidence necessarily. There is still in China's psyche a deep strain of inferiority and a very thin skin, and which is why you see often the government blaming foreigners for wrong problems, or when things go wrong, they always blame some foreign powers, or say it's foreigners, or it's bad influence from abroad. This has a lot of resonance in history, where bad things always came from outside of China. They built a wall to try and keep foreigners out several times. But nevertheless, that's, even with the success they've had recently, that thin skin and sense of inferiority is not that far beneath the surface. We often tend to think of China and the Chinese leadership in monolithic terms. You hear the President Xi Jinping, and often Americans see the leadership of the Communist Party as speaking for all of China, and that the country operates in lockstep. That's far from the truth. China's intellectual tradition, for thousands of years has had a, very strong, deep strain of dissent, and that's traditional within the system. So it's always important to think that while we hear, from specific people in China as to what supposedly China is thinking, in the same way, when you hear leaders in the United States say something, we don't automatically assume they speak for all Americans or speak for all history. They're speaking to their particular moment and their particular role and responsibility at the time. And so we should never confuse what individuals in China are thinking for what the entire country might be thinking, or where the people are thinking, even though there's obviously quite a lot of overlap. Another thing that's important to realize is that this sense of history remains in China, even during their long, dynastic periods. There was always a lot of historical scholars, people judging the history of China and their current situation against the past. And that habit continues, both as a result of the cultural influence, but also, remember, the Communist Party is based on a Marxist tradition, and that Marxist tradition is very focused on history and seeing changes in economies and in countries as a result of historical forces. So they spend a lot of time thinking about that and how things are going to change and whether or not historical forces are aligned or opposed to what they'd like to do. Along with this line of dissent in China, there's even a name for it. They call it the struggle between two lines, where the two ends of the political spectrum sort of argue with each other and move back and forth and have alternate periods of influence. And there's lots and lots of internal historical works that talk about the movement between various extremes. Most obvious example perhaps is the Cultural Revolution, where one strain swung wildly to the left, and then after Deng Xiaoping took over, there was a swing towards the other direction of gradual economic and political reform. In fact, after the Cultural Revolution and Deng Xiaoping's implementation, the image that China had of its government was one of economic and political reform. In fact, Deng Xiaoping actively supported the eventual introduction of local and national elections for leadership. China was eventually supposed to become a country where the rule of law would prevail instead of just the rule of the party. The election idea was implemented a little bit in the mid-90s, but then faded away as there were all sorts of problems. The centrality of the party remains key. And in fact, I think the party realized or found it difficult to try and match its goals for continued leadership along with the sort of goals of the masses. You'll find some in China saying that, well, the democratic model is just not appropriate for China, or that the Chinese people are not well suited to it, that it's a unique condition for the West. I think you'll see the examples of Hong Kong and Taiwan put that myth to rest, but nevertheless, it's still a very active idea within China. So with this sort of gradual opening and gradual reform and lots of legal reforms, you had Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and then along came Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping was definitely a move away from that reform side and towards a more strict and leftist and party-centric view of how China should be ruled. Xi Jinping and his current cadre of leadership strongly feel and felt and continues to feel that the party has to be the ultimate source and arbiter of political power and decision-making authority within the country. Xi Jinping is committed to legal reform, very much so. And in fact, the recent Congress, in addition to changes in Hong Kong's law, they also implemented all sorts of reforms to the legal and civil codes within China to make the courts and the legal systems operate more efficiently. However, there are very clear limits on that. The law has to remain subservient to the party and serve the will of the party, and the party remains paramount. Xi Jinping came into power at a time when people were losing a lot of confidence in the party because of extraordinary corruption. The economic and other reforms had led to sort of a Wild West feel in the economy, and many in the leadership and the party were extraordinarily corrupt, and it was losing a lot of popular support. So he really came into power claiming that he was going to fix that, reform the corruption, eliminate corruption, and he has done an extraordinarily good job of actually doing that. Of course, the downside, he's also strengthened the party and made the party, again, the most important power in the country, and eliminated a lot of some of the other competing power centers that, had provided other models or other opportunities for reform. Xi Jinping did a couple other things too. He rejected, explicitly the idea that China can be a multi-ethnic country. China has extraordinary numbers of minority populations. In fact, the Chinese flag with its stars, the main star is supposed to represent the Han Chinese, but the 4 other stars represent 4 ethnic groups within the country. And that was always a big point of pride within the country and within the Constitution and the party, was that they were able to meld these different ethnicities together. Xi has changed that. He really demands total subjugation of the minority populations with, I think, what everyone can agree is truly horrific results, both in Tibet and Xinjiang, and with the Uyghur and Muslim populations. It's really quite terrible. The Han Chinese, of course, make up about 95% of the population. It's quite large. The average Chinese person doesn't really know much about this repression. And even if they do know much about it, it doesn't bother a lot of them. There, of course, are dissenters, but by and large, most Chinese feel pretty good about the way things are going. And like in most places, most Chinese are primarily focused with economic growth and economic confidence and satisfaction. And Xi Jinping has, clearly continued the path of improving that with strong economic growth. Despite all this, growth and extraordinary success that China has lately, one of the world's largest trading powers, influence all around the globe, one can't really say it's acting like a confident power. Confident power, someone who, feels where they are, genuinely is able to admit mistakes, learn from them, is open to criticism, and build on that and expect, and accept that there are things that they could be doing better. That is absolutely not the case with China, and certainly not in a public way. China's reactions to the COVID crisis and sort of retreating, being opaque in sharing information, not revealing a lot, being resistant to having people come in and study what's going on, are pretty much exactly what you would expect from China's past behavior when, actions are being called out or there's, sort of reasons for criticism. You see that a lot when China makes a mistake. People don't want to share the information. There's very little willingness to discuss those failures, and increasing, extreme sensitivity to criticism. Even while the West is criticizing China, from the outside for its behaviors, the biggest victims of this hiding and this lack of ability to admit mistakes are the Chinese themselves, who were themselves kept in the dark while the threat was going. I think most, clearly in the case of the doctor who first started reporting the illness, who himself died as a victim of it. So on a slightly broader narrative, and getting back to the historical trends and the way that the Chinese view historical trends, even before Xi came on the stage, there was this idea within the Chinese, intellectuals, that the time of the West had passed. I mean, the West had, several hundred years of leading the world, had dominated China and dominated most of the rest of the world. But, the run was over, and it was natural that Asia and China should move to become the ruling center of the world. You keep hearing them talk about the Asia century. The evidence that they cite for the West decline only seems to accumulate sort of day by day. I mean, the financial crisis in 2008 was cited frequently. They say, well, we used to be the teachers, or we used to be the students, to you, but now you've clearly showing yourselves unable to regulate, and your ideas about how to manage economies are wrong. So it is now our time to take over and be the teachers of you. You know, unfortunately and depressingly, the election of Barack Obama was also a sign to the Chinese that we were in the process of losing our way. Most Chinese couldn't imagine that the United States would elect a black man president, sort of representative of some of the deep-seated feelings and prejudices that they have. Right now, the Chinese media, as per usual pattern, is reveling in the news of the recent riots that we have experienced. It buttresses their own myth-making that democracy is a flawed system whose time is ended. But I would also caution that this is, you know, that some of the extremes of this idea is again thinking about just the current trend of the struggle between two lines. Even while many in China were talking about the decline of the West, other intellectuals, although not so much publicly now, we're talking about why was it that the West was successful? What was it that it offered the people of the world? Was it personal liberty? Was it freedoms? Was it some other idea beyond simply economic growth that made the West so dominant, particularly in the United States? And so it was that struggle between two lines again. And I raise that because right now, if you look at the news or listen to Chinese academics or Chinese diplomats, you're not going to hear any of those dissenting ideas, because dissenting right now with Xi Jinping is really a bad career move. But don't think that all Chinese buy into the idea that democracy has no place in China or that the end of the West is, you know, is imminent. It just happens right now. The needle is pointing more in Xi Jinping's direction than it is in other places. I'd also note that Xi Jinping and his cohort are not going to last forever, maybe longer than the expected 10 years, and he's removed any limits to his period in office. But, you know, he will leave the stage one day, and I think many believe, I believe too, there's going to be a swing away from his form of extremism, as, you know, the limits of what that has led to, become more apparent. One reason China really likes to talk about how bad the West is and sort of blame foreigners for problems is that its own problems remain extraordinarily large. You know, despite the economic success, there remain really significant economic issues, demographic challenges. China's population is expected to peak in the next several years. In fact, the working age population peaked between 2010 and 2015. Environmental catastrophes and other issues abound, real discrepancies in income and disparities in regions. China remains a brittle and thin-skinned leadership because it really is so aware of the many problems it faces. You know, we hear about the international relations problems China has, but when the leadership of China goes to bed at night and when they wake up in the morning, they are thinking 100% about domestic issues and how to control that. Unfortunately, they're also, and Xi Jinping and his party members are also thinking about how best to, you know, maintain the primacy and the power of the party. The party really is sort of the world's largest sort of brotherhood organization. There are about 70 million members, and they're all looking out for each other and trying to make sure that the party is still around, to make sure that their livelihood is not threatened. So one of the traditional threats to China has been attacks from outside and the territorial integrity of China. And so because of the sense of history, the Chinese government remains extraordinarily sensitive to any idea that the country cannot be held together, or that there would be revolts in different parts of the country, or that the government somehow can't keep the country together. This is, one reason, if not the primary reason, why the PRC is so focused on Hong Kong and Taiwan. You know, Taiwan hasn't been part of the mainland since World War II, and yet it still is a central part of the government's identity and what its claimed mission is in terms of, returning Taiwan to the government. It's also part of the focus on Tibet and other peripheral regions. So dissent anywhere anywhere in that region, and any statements by the leadership of Taiwan, in Hong Kong or Tibet or anywhere, undercuts that whole reason and entire legitimacy of the PRC and the party. And so that has to be countered. And this is one reason why Hong Kong is so important to the issue of the PRC right now. So moving on to Hong Kong, what is happening right now? So as I said, the original deal about the island of Hong Kong, which is just a small part of what we refer to now as the territory of Hong Kong, was granted to Britain in perpetuity. However, the new territories, which is, comprises a much larger territory, but also all the power plants, all the water plants, all the sort of infrastructure needed to keep the city going, was only granted to to Britain for 100 years or 99 years. And so when it became clear that that was going to expire, because of the perpetual gift of Hong Kong Island, Britain had some leverage in negotiating a deal that would retain some autonomy for Hong Kong after reversion. So the Chinese passed what is called the Basic Law, which codified the idea of one country, two systems, and laid the groundwork for what was supposed to be self-governance by Hong Kong and non-interference by China. The idea of one country, two systems wasn't necessarily new. They actually thought about that before as a way to try and attract Taiwan as well. But it was actually codified in this Basic Law for Hong Kong. And the British, and under that, it guaranteed full autonomy for Hong Kong, except in areas of national security, for 50 years. And now we're about 21 years into that. The British agreed to it, and everyone, hailed it as a landmark achievement in managing to, retain Hong Kong, but yet also serving the political needs of the party in Beijing. That Basic Law also called for Hong Kong to write its own national security law. Every territory needs to have a national security law. Every country does. And Hong Kong didn't have one, so the Basic Law instructed Hong Kong and the Hong Kong legislature to write its own national security law, which would provide things for like extradition to the mainland, or making certain traitorous acts illegal, make it clear where the lines were in terms of where Beijing's authority was when it came to threats to national security. And it's difficult to argue with that, simply that idea. However, that turned out to be really hard to do. And so for about 20 years, the Hong Kong legislature kept putting the job off, didn't want to do it. When they started actually drafting a law, there were protests starting, and that was late spring and early summer. And the situation only got worse and worse and worse. From Xi Jinping's viewpoint, the situation has become increasingly intolerable. He sees the protests as a direct repudiation of the PRC and as a humiliation of him and the party. And he's worked really, really hard at trying to find a way to stop the protests, except for the fact that the people of Hong Kong are fairly stubborn and persistent, and the government in Hong Kong has been unable to stop the protests, incapable of imposing some order. And in elections last year, PRC candidates took a huge beating. And again, there's supposed to be another round of elections in September, and the PRC candidates look to lose again. So there was a reason for the PRC to act. So the legal reason, it's paper thin, but nevertheless it is a legal reason for what the PRC has done, is simply say, listen, you were supposed to do a national security law, you didn't do it, so we're going to impose one. Xi Jinping really has no patience for actual genuine dissent under his rule. Right now, we don't know what's in the law. It simply says that it's going to be imposed. And the actual details of the law are going to come out over time. China on the party and Xi Jinping almost certainly expected an international backlash of this move, but they figured it probably wasn't going to be so bad that it couldn't be weathered, and that they couldn't, get through it, and that at the end of the day, that the situation would change. The usual pattern when China does things like this is they announce some incredibly draconian measure and then do nothing about it, right? So they impose a law that calls for crazy things, and then they don't do anything about it. And then over the months after that, people go, oh, well, we were really worried about something, but nothing bad has really happened. And then slowly but surely, the Chinese government sort of moves to implement changes and make certain things. So while we don't know what's in the law, we expect it will be certainly talk about academic freedoms. It'll talk about ability to protest, free speech. There'll be deportations, made possible, and all sorts of other changes. It's a serious blow to the autonomy of Hong Kong, and I think certainly the United States, Britain, and other countries are absolutely right to be worried about it. What are our options? I mean, the president decided he was going to, the Secretary Pompeo, remove the certification of Hong Kong as an autonomous power. That doesn't have any actual impact on its own. There have to be other changes to change certain treaties and agreements that we have. However, the goal is we don't actually want to hurt Hong Kong, right? We don't want to change their ability to do what they need to do. We don't want to hurt their citizens, and we certainly don't want to hurt the interests of American citizens and American companies that live in Hong Kong. Right now, there are about 85,000 American citizens that live in the territory. And because of that, there aren't a lot of things that we can actually do that would hurt China, but not hurt Hong Kong. And I think the Chinese government probably figured that in. So what I would expect right now is China's going to lay low. Not much more is going to happen. There's going to be a few more protests in Hong Kong, but the energy and passion behind those will slowly wither out over the weeks and months and possibly years to come. People will be arrested. You won't hear a lot about it. There'll be restrictions put in. There'll be a lot of self-censorship. Academic freedoms will be reduced and other changes. And it's a real negative blow and a significant point of sadness for those people who've known and loved Hong Kong over the years. But how to respond is very difficult to know. But that's the status where we stand now. Britain, to its credit, looks to be opening up potential for immigration to a number of Hong Kong citizens and doing all it can to establish or maintain what autonomy is still going to be possible moving forward. So with that, I think we're about 12:35. I think that's a short introduction. We covered a lot of ground. I hope that was interesting and useful, and be delighted to take some questions and get into some further details on any topics you all are interested in hearing about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. I am not sitting in the sanctuary right now, but just miss seeing everybody. So I thought I would include that backdrop for you all. Very pleased to join and hear this. We do welcome questions, and the best way probably to do that would be to type those into your Q&A icon at the bottom. I do believe also, well, actually I'll stop there. So if you type those in, and then I will be able to moderate those and share those with Paul as best as I can. While we wait for some of those questions to emerge, I wonder, Paul, if you could just tell a little bit of the story of your relationship with China. I mean, part of the value of these webinars is to learn about the topic at hand, but also to be connected with one another as a congregation. And so I'd just be fascinated to hear about your relationship with China and what you love about it, what it's given you, and your hopes and fears for that in the weeks and months and years to come.
No, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I was a State Department Foreign Service officer, and previously hadn't had necessarily a focus on China. My family had some interest in Asia, and I wanted, within the State Department, I wanted to work on Asia issues. In the early 90s, they didn't have any room for me on the Japan desk, so I walked down the hall, and the guys at the China desk were sitting back and having beers and potato chips. And so I said, maybe I'll give this one a shot. And they had a job for me. And I ended up doing a fair number of trade negotiations in the early 90s on intellectual property and other topics with the Chinese. And then in the mid and late 90s, I studied Chinese through the State Department. And then, Suzanne, my wife, and our only child at the time, Elizabeth, we moved to China in 1997. And where I began 5 years working at the embassy there. It was a really sort of exciting roller coaster of a time. We had the WTO accession, very exciting, really expanded trade negotiations, but we also had the bombing of the Chinese embassy. We had a shooting down of a EP-3 plane by the Chinese in the South China Sea. Very sort of wild swings and ups and downs in the relationship. With economic ties were far smaller then than they are now, but still incredibly important and really growing. And it was clear that the US-China relationship was going to be, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important relationships in the world. It was a time of a lot of enthusiasm and optimism. And no one thought that China was going to become a democratic power at the time. I mean, this idea that somehow the US was lulled into thinking China was never going to be a threat or didn't have the potential to be bad, that was never the case. However, at the time, and there was a strong feeling, one, that China had over 1 billion people who were living in extreme poverty, and they were in the process of coming out of that. And the personal individual freedom that Chinese have experienced in their changes was really thrilling to see. I mean, every single year that I was there, people saw their livelihoods and standard of living getting better. It wasn't just like, oh, as I look back, things are better. No, every year it got better. When I got there were mostly bikes on the street, and when I left, everyone had a car. And that was in, a period of 5 years. It's just extraordinary changes. And so the confidence and excitement among ordinary Chinese and curiosity and enthusiasm was really infectious. There were plenty of worries around that and plenty of concern about what China might do, and the deep understanding that it was never going to be a democratic power, at least not anytime soon. And that certainly there was a trend in China to see all foreigners as potential enemies and to do that. But I think with plenty of good reason, there was the hope that with the right incentives, China would grow and adhere more to what we consider to be international norms of behavior. And certainly even within the first 5 years after accession to the WTO, I think it's strongly arguable that that's what happened. They took a bit of a wrong turn after that for various reasons. Internal corruption was an enormous problem, and a traditional one, frankly, in China, but an enormous problem, and that needed to be addressed. And unfortunately, the answer to that has proven to be depressing. But there's nothing automatic about the US and China necessarily becoming enemies. But when I left China, came back to the United States, continued to work on trade issues and stuff, it's been continually fascinating to see the place evolve, but also very depressing to see some of the negative changes that have happened. And recent moves in the country are really a repudiation of some of the promise, I think, that we saw earlier. But those there still are plenty of people in China who hope that it can become a better place, recognize that it needs to be a better place, and do a better job of serving all of its citizens, not just the few in the party.
Thanks, Paul. So the subtext there is that your involvement with China is because of beer and potato chips. Is that right?
That's how it all started. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, and look at where it's ended up. That's great.
It was a high carb intro.
We have some good questions. So I'm going to just start at the top from Pat, which is a great name. What's the best approach the U.S. can take towards China to prevent or limit a recurrence of a worldwide pandemic? So it sounds like this is not just focused on coronavirus, but what else might happen in the future?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. It's a weird fact of sort of biology and epidemiology that each year's annual flu virus seems to originate in China somewhere. For a variety of conditions. A lot of people have wondered why that is, and there are a lot of possible answers. No one's quite sure, but without a doubt, and it's not always the case. I mean, there are other flus that come from other places, Middle East or Latin America, or even the United States. The Spanish flu, for example, was first noticed in Kansas. So, China doesn't have a monopoly on starting. It's called the Spanish flu because it was actually the Spanish government that was the first willing to admit that it had it. Our own government in 1917 and 18 primarily, didn't want to admit we had a real problem. So it was not called the American flu. No, that's an aside. The CDC and the FDA for many, many years has had an ongoing productive working relationship with China to study the emergence of new flu strains. And the flu vaccine that we get every year is based on the work that those teams do together. So, you know, every year, winter and summer, there are teams from the CDC working to gather information about the flu, designing a vaccine, and that's the vaccine we get the sort of the next fall and winter, if not, 18 months later. So that's a great example of how we can work together to, sort of stop disease, and it's been productive for both. Even though the vaccines that we come up with aren't often effective in time, because it takes 18 months to develop them, aren't effective in time for the Chinese, they recognize that it's a good move overall. This work has been supported, of course, by the World Health Organization and other countries provide a lot of talent and information as well. So in a positive way, there are opportunities to do a lot of good viral and epidemiological work with the Chinese, but it has to be done on a cooperative basis. I mentioned the sort of brittleness and thin-skinnedness and resistance to criticism that the Chinese have. So going in with a chip on your shoulder or lecturing the Chinese is rarely the way to make progress. Going in with an attitude of, how can we work together to make each of us better and to make the overall situation better is almost always the way to move forward. I would hope we would be able quickly to get back to that kind of mood. I don't actually know what the status of the CDC project is, if they're still there. There are quite a number of people in China still working on things. And particularly early on in the COVID crisis, we were able to send some experts to China. I don't know what the status of those are, but hopefully those efforts will not be stopped and we'll continue to be able to do that. China has a lot to answer for sort of the opaqueness with which it treated COVID-19 and the emergence and the seriousness of the issue. I think a lot of that has to do with their own internal problems, not necessarily intending to mislead the West. It needs to be more open about what happened. At the same time, I don't think they are as deserving, or frankly, it's not as productive to excoriate them constantly as failing on this point, because that is not going to be the basis on which we're able to move forward.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions on trade that I'm going to lump together. The Vandewaters, hello, Paul and Clara Beth, wanted you to just talk about the future of US and China trade relations, and connected to that, Ted and Paige Pusey wonder whether China needs the US trade relationship more than we do, or do we need it more than they do? What's the balance of need there?
Yeah, thanks. And well, greetings, Paul and Clara Beth. It's great to know you're on the line, and I'm glad you're able to get connected. The issue of who needs each other more, I think, leads us to a zero-sum view of how trade works. And I reject that about trade in general. Trade is about making us better off. It's about, the United States trades with other countries, so we have a higher standard of living. China trades with other countries, so it has a higher standard of living, and the benefits are two-way. Trading increases both of our benefits. We both have extraordinary exposure to each other in terms of trade and investment. By some measures, as much as a third of China's GDP depends in some part on US or foreign investment overall. So if you were to eliminate that, I don't know if any country can take that kind of drop in GDP, particularly one that's so invested in its own economic strength as its sole, reason for being. So it's very, very, exposed to foreign investment and the need for trade. The overall portion of trade as GDP has gone down in the mid-90s. Actually, 10% of all GDP was dependent on exports. That's gone down quite a bit. The internal markets within China are extraordinarily vibrant. There's a consumer, huge growth in consumerism within China, and that has, led to a lot of internal, economic growth, and that's all to the good. In fact, that's what a normal economy should be. United States' portion of trade that deals with China's portion of GDP is far smaller, but even when, China cut off agricultural purchases from the United States, you saw the huge impact among the farm communities and the farming economies of the Midwest. Companies like Boeing and GE and Intel depend an enormous amount on the sales to China. China is a critical part of the world economy. And that's not a bad thing because, there are problems with it, don't get me wrong, but in itself, it's not a bad thing because it leads all of us to lead, a much higher standard of living and able to, achieve things that we couldn't otherwise. If we think we can, of course, can we do without China? Yes. But is that a world that we want to live in? Are we willing to take that kind of economic hit? Are we willing to survive that? And at what cost? Also, there are 1.5 billion people in China who would suffer extraordinarily as well under that. And do we want that to happen as well? I think we can continue our strong trading relationship without it turning into one of confrontation. That does require both countries to do things. It requires work on both parts. Often, both historically and even now, we tend to view whatever happens within China towards us as a result of what we ourselves are doing. That's not the case. China has to show some responsibility as well. In many cases, they fail on that. In other cases, we fail on that. And a better mechanism for discussing with them where our joint opportunities lie, I think would be useful. One challenge is that China is extraordinarily good at dividing us from our other allies. Using their tools of economic growth and investment themselves, they are able to appeal to other countries, Europe and Japan or Korea, and now in Latin America and Africa, and sort of either explicitly or implicitly sort of split us apart. And then it's more difficult for the United States and other countries to influence China if there are other countries that don't agree with that. And so that's a real challenge, and it's a call to us, I believe, particularly with Europe and with other developed countries, to do a better job of coordinating our response and being consistent in our messaging to China about where our mutual interests lie.
You used the word influence there, and that connects to that's the final question specifically about trade coming from Boyd Jones about, are there treaties or agreements such as favored nation status that can be amended or canceled to put influence or apply pressure on China? Is that a lever?
Yeah, well, that term most favored nation status, they changed it to normal trade relation status just because it sounded so weird, when in fact most favored just meant the treatment you were getting from everyone else. Yes, in fact, President Trump did impose special tariffs on Chinese goods. Many of those tariffs remain despite what they call the phase 1 deal, the trade deal that was reached in February with China. That definitely had an impact on China. They will never admit that it did, but it clearly did. And they imposed tariffs and additional restrictions on goods coming from the United States. The problem with tariffs is that, despite what you might hear, Chinese aren't paying them. US consumers pay those tariffs. So it's a bit of shooting ourselves in the foot. But those definitely have an impact, and cutting off trade and cutting off opportunities has an influence. I'm afraid to say that, well, the Chinese are convinced, or at least they say they believe, that they can do without the United States while the United States needs China. And so, as I said, I don't think that's the right metric to be looking at, but they certainly often seem to act in a way that they can take much more pain than we are willing to take. They actually do believe that. They think our system is so weak that we can't handle an economic pain at all, whereas the strength of the Chinese people and system is that they can handle all sorts of pain. I think that's not entirely true and is a real challenge for them, but that's the sort of approach you tend to see in some of their public statements. So it's frustrating, and again, it requires both parties to understand they depend on each other quite a bit. But yes, there are things that we can do that have an influence on them. Whether it's the right kind of influence or that it gets the right kind of response that we want is hard to say. Remember, I said the Chinese have always said that foreigners want to split China and keep it weak. That's the message that the central government has in a lot of cases. By taking actions in China, we seem to underscore that message and make it easier for them to make that case. On whether it's on economic or military grounds. Of the 18 or 19 countries that surround China, we have military cooperation agreements with every one of them except North Korea. Chinese military looks at that and says, hey, US military is trying to surround us and keep us weak and get ready to invade us. I don't think that's true. I don't think any of us think that's true, but that's the view the Chinese like to put forward. So we have to be careful on how we act, or at least explain it so they don't misunderstand our intentions.
Tom wants to know whether there are any reliable indications whether Chinese financial instruments, particularly stocks, are free from market manipulation.
The vast majority are generally free from market manipulation, I would say. I mean, the Shanghai Stock Exchange is not as robust or as well regulated as that in Hong Kong or on the New York Stock Exchange, but quite a number of Chinese companies are traded on both, Hang Seng and the New York Stock Exchange. One of the reasons the Chinese don't want to destroy Hong Kong is because they really value its presence and stature as the world's third largest financial center. It's extraordinary. It's well regulated and well monitored. So, and the government itself, as I said, they are trying to do a lot of reforms. The stock markets in Shanghai and Guangzhou have their problems. The biggest problem is not with manipulation of the market itself, but actually transparency of the financial data undergirding the companies themselves. And that's a systemic problem within China. It's something actually you heard the president talk about when we talked about Hong Kong, when that he would look at the financial data disclosure requirements of Chinese companies that were listed in New York. And that's a recognition of the fact that there are real serious problems with that. And so there's manipulation in terms of that issue, but as far as the market itself, it's not bad.
Thanks. Looks like you've piqued some interest when you spoke of, the Hong Kong and Taiwan and what's happening there. David Wilcox, first of all, wants to thank you for this fascinating presentation.
Thanks, David. Well, yours was great, David. I only hope to aspire as good as yours was.
Exactly. It's a tough act to follow, but you're doing a great job of that. So based on what happened in Hong Kong, what are the implications for the autonomy of Taiwan, and in what ways does the Hong Kong situation provide a model for what might happen in Taiwan? In what ways does it not? And would they perhaps differ?
Yeah, well, the most obvious difference between the two is that for Taiwan, there's really no basic law. And so there's no legal structure under which the Chinese could try and impose some sort of influence. Relations between Taiwan and PRC were improving gradually in the sort of early 2000s and with a relatively pro-PRC government. But that has changed recently. The PRC, again, explicitly but also implicitly, tried with the actions in Hong Kong to provide a model for Taiwan. The idea was that if Hong Kong thrived under this one country, two systems model, the people of Taiwan would automatically see, that, gee, this was a great option, and that they would, absolutely want to come back to the motherland and be reunified under a similar sort of legal structure. Much to their dismay, the exact opposite has occurred. If you've ever been to Taiwan, it's extraordinary place. I mean, the democracy works well. It's well managed. And so the Chinese have decided to go in a different way by putting a lot of foreign pressure on Taiwan, keeping them away from international meetings, trying to ramp up, making threatening moves in the South China Sea and in the waters near Taiwan. It is possible to imagine a future, and people are planning for this, that the Chinese, depending on what Taiwan does, one thing that PRC absolutely cannot handle is a declaration of independence by Taiwan. If Taiwan said it was going to do that, it would absolutely require a response, most likely a military response from the PRC. Again, that's because it's so central to their identity and credibility as a ruling party. And that would be a genuine tragedy. So Taiwan I believe, is unlikely to do that. And I think the US is unlikely to claim it's a separate territory. After all, US policy right now, enshrined by law, is that Taiwan remains a part of China, but it does have a separate status. So I don't think it has a direct impact on China, on Taiwan right now, the developments in Hong Kong. But what it does do is make it clear to Taiwan that any sort of attempt at accommodation with the PRC, particularly under the current government, is bound to fail and makes anything like that much, much less likely.
Okay, just noting the time, it's 1 o'clock. Are you able to go for about 10 more minutes, Paul? I don't want to overtake your time. Good.
No, absolutely.
And looks like we've got some good questions left. I apologize that we will not have time for new questions from this point on. So listen well, everyone, to the questions of your fellow listeners. There were two questions that I see a connection in terms of how the U.S. responds, or the U.S. stance towards Chinese territorial claims, or you could call it aggressiveness, which is how the words our questioners asked, towards the South China Sea, towards the islands in Southeast Asia, and perhaps in the area also of intellectual property, and that's a different bucket, obviously. But what would be the U.S. stance? And I know that's a question that's fraught with, where your role is and all of that. But just what are your thoughts about that, as you're able to share?
Yeah, those are really important and really, really difficult questions. If there were easy answers, I think we'd be having, this is not a new problem. It's been a problem as long as I've been exposed to Chinese issues. And it's certainly been a problem, I think, for the last 40 years in the bilateral relationship. The territories, whether it's the South China Sea or, out towards Japan or towards the Philippines and other places, is a real issue and longstanding. And the legal status of those areas has also not been settled in international law. So, whether you're talking about the Spratlys, which are, near, depending on who you're talking to, or, near Vietnam or belong to other countries, or China, it's difficult. China has some historical basis for making its claims, but most of those tend to fall apart under scrutiny. I mean, there was a case at The Hague that China was certain it was going to win about the bases in the South China Sea. It ended up losing really, really badly. To the extent there has been sort of international judgments, China hasn't had the right to sort of build those bases. But no one else does either, and no one's going to go in and blow them up, and no one has the authority to sort of remove them. So how do you act and how do you respond to that? The reality is that China's military power is absolutely increasing, and they have the ability to project some of that power. And if they are willing to go to war over it, are any of the rest of us willing to do that as well? I'm not sure, and not sure that anyone believes it's really worth it at this point. But it's a real challenge. I don't have any good answers on it, but I am convinced, I think most observers are, these moves have to be opposed. It's sort of a problem of gradualism. You say, okay, well, that's not good, but it's not so much. And then the Chinese keep moving on. The Chinese are clearly counting on the idea they establish something, sit back, don't do anything more, wait till everyone's guard is down, and then do more and more and more. And where does it end is a real challenge. So I don't have a good answer on that. The intellectual property question, I think, is a very good one. It's useful to point out that the industrial base of the United States was based on intellectual property theft from Britain. Our textile industry in New England was based because people went into the factories in Britain and copied down the designs for all the various machines and factories. So that, by the way, the Chinese love pointing that out, but nevertheless, it is true. So, however, in the modern world, that's not an acceptable way to proceed. And in fact, I do believe that the situation regarding intellectual property protection has increased dramatically over the last 20 years within China. If you are a company, Nike has won legal cases. Lots of companies have won legal cases against counterfeit products in China. And the biggest victims of intellectual property theft in China, by the way, are Chinese companies. Every successful Chinese company has to battle back counterfeiters. It's just a common, frequent problem in the place. More disturbing and more, I think, threatening are the cyber attacks on American companies. Just about every major American company has suffered incursions or attacks by Chinese entities, whether they're military or civil or private. It's difficult to tell. Trying to get information, our defense companies and high-tech sectors. My company does high-end biotechnology products are always under threat of sort of expropriation of our intellectual property. The U.S. government is trying its best and has done a lot of work in pushing back against that. It's again really hard to stop. We've indicted a number of Chinese officials and military officers who've been linked to various thefts of this kind. So, that's one step to take. Those companies that operate in China have clearly made the calculation that the risk is worth it. A number of companies have various strategies. One, you don't take your latest and greatest technology to China, but you take the second or third generation and take them to China. They get copied, but by the time those get mastered, you've already moved your own stuff beyond. And so the theft itself is not a particular barrier to trade, but it's an extra cost that shouldn't be there and is extraordinarily frustrating. We continue to push back at every opportunity, and I think we have missed some opportunities to punish and influence Chinese entities that have been involved in theft. The problem now is it's very difficult to pull apart different strands of criticism. We have so many avenues in which to criticize China that it's difficult to isolate one aspect of the relationship and say, this is why we're doing something. China then says, response, well, you're just doing that because you hate China in general. And look at everywhere else, isn't there anything good that we're doing, kind of thing. It's not, may not be right, but it's difficult to sort of counter that. I think we have so many challenges across the board. It's increasingly difficult to figure out ways to approach each individual one because we don't have an unlimited number of levers. And so it is a challenge. Not maybe a super answer to that, but I think illustrative of some of the challenges that we're facing.
Okay, we're gonna, I think, close on this one. What do you think about the number of Chinese students studying in the US and the creation of American universities in China for our students? And that comes from John Woods.
Yeah, okay, John, thanks. There are hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the US right now studying, and well, actually maybe a lot of them went home just recently as a result of COVID, but every year and have been for decades now. I think it's an extraordinary opportunity for both sides. One, exposing Chinese students to the diversity and richness of American life and American academia and practices. And in addition, it's a great boon to our universities. The reality is a lot of universities depend on the revenue that they get from foreign students, not just Chinese, but Chinese is a large part of it. There's a lot of criticism. Now, what happened before, when students came, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s often, many of them stayed in the United States and have continued being productive members of US and American society. So, and that's been an enormous benefit to us. And those students continue to be an enormous benefit to us. And so in the way that trade helps both sides, it's helped. Now as China's become a nicer place to live in and wealthier itself, a lot of those people want to go back, which is perfectly understandable, but advances continue. Obviously, the highest profile question is the idea of, are these people spies? Are they stealing things? Or is he using an opportunity to take advantage of the openness of the US system? I think the case on both sides is a bit overstated. Yes, having Chinese come to the United States is great and exposes them to the United States, but it's not going to turn them into Democrats overnight. Mitt Romney did 2 years in France, and he didn't come back from that being a socialist, right? So there's you're not going to give up everything you are, everything you've learned just because you're exposed to the United States. But it does help international understanding, and it does help. I mean, after all, Xi Jinping himself spent quite a bit of time in Iowa studying. Didn't change his overall view of the party, but nevertheless, it gave him a better perspective on the United States, perhaps. On the other hand, if you look at the actual numbers as opposed to the very high-profile cases, the number of people who are supposedly spying or stealing stuff from academic institutions remains relatively small, or in fact, very, very small. And we are appropriately putting safeguards against that kind of behavior. I worry quite a bit about stereotyping of Chinese researchers. I mean, some of the incidents of people of Asian descent being criticized over COVID is deeply worrying, as are many other trends recently, or incidents recently. And that criticism has in fact already put a damper on some of the positive cooperation that we might have. In terms of science, science happens because scientists talk to each other. And the more scientists you have talking to each other, the more opportunity there is for sparks to ignite and progress happening. And China has a lot of great minds and a lot of great scientists. If any of us are horribly sick with a rare disease and the only cure has been invented by a Chinese scientist, would you refuse to take it on that basis? No, of course not. And so why should we limit the ability of not just in medicine, but in any field to limit that opportunity? That's not to say there aren't real dangers, there aren't real problems. The Chinese government has said it has a whole of government approach towards, isolating or to advancing its own interests. Of course, everything I said about China, about science and progress, the Chinese themselves need to believe it. They have to understand that progress comes from working with other people and openness to other ideas and openness and things like that. It's been there at different times, and I hope it'll get there sooner hope it get there again sooner rather than later.
Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. Patrick, thank you for leading us through the question and answer period. I wanted to say on behalf of Dudley Schatterberg and the Men of Westminster, I'd like to thank you, Paul, for for staying home and talking with us today. We appreciate you sharing with us your experiences in China and your insights on US-China relations, especially during these challenging times. Thank you everyone who joined our Zoom meeting today. Stay tuned for news of Men of Westminster speakers, either at breakfast or on Zoom, starting up again in September. And I always like to say the building may be closed, but the church is open. And in that spirit, I'd like to ask Patrick to close us in prayer.
Thanks very much. No, thanks, thanks, Nancy. Really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening.
Indeed. Thank you, Nancy, and everyone in the Men of Westminster. Wherever you are, in whatever place you may be, let us come together in a closing prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks as we conclude this time together for the blessings and the movement of your Spirit in Paul's life, the fruits of which have been very much on display in his work and his wisdom, his willingness to share and to look ahead, to claim not knowing where he does not know, but also to own that which he has seen and experienced and observed. and pray that our conversations would lift us to greater knowledge of what is real and true in your world. And as part of that truth, we claim what we often hear in worship, that is great, or as far is the east from the west, so great is your love for us in Jesus Christ. So we claim that love from east to west, north and south, and ask that love would move in how we act here and in our communities during this very difficult time, giving us courage to listen and speak and act and do as you would have us do, in Christ's name. Amen. Grace and peace to you all. Thank you.